Hi, and welcome back to GCSE History lessons. In this lesson, we will recap what we have learnt in the first 10 lessons of this course, which covered the Cold War ideologies, as well as the events from 1943 until the end of 1946 that started the Cold War. By the end of the lesson, you should understand and be able to explain the main ideologies of the Cold War, as well as the sequence of events from 1943 until 1946. Let's begin by taking a look at the ideas of the Cold War. The USSR was a communist one-party state. It was able to control its entire economy and direct manpower and resources to whatever goal it wished. The USSR had elections so the people could vote, but the Communist Party could never be voted out. This is what's called a one-party state. For these reasons, the government of the USSR did not need to consult the people and could make decisions quickly, especially in a crisis. The downside of this political and economic system was that the people of the USSR lacked freedom to choose their political representatives or to make their own businesses. The USA was the opposite of the USSR in many ways. It was a democracy, meaning it allowed its people to vote in free and fair democratic elections, and it was also capitalist, meaning its citizens could own property and create private businesses. The downside of the US capitalist democratic system was that it could not control its politics and economy as easily as the USSR could. It was also sometimes slower to make decisions than the USSR because of the requirement to debate laws and gain approval from various government institutions before making important decisions. The USA's system was strong because the freedom and rights given to its citizens encouraged competitive businesses and new ideas. Throughout the Cold War, we also see the idea of socialism, where nations create systems or services for everyone in society, paid for through taxes or the nationalisation of key industries. Socialism was seen by some communists as a stepping stone between capitalism and communism, and it created tensions within and between Western countries. An example of a socialist policy is the UK's National Health Service. It's socialist but not communist because people in the UK can still own businesses and own property. Another Cold War idea was decolonisation, where European powers give independence to their former colonies. This was a recurring theme throughout the Cold War because the European empires could no longer afford to keep up their colonies after the devastation of World War II. To give an idea of the extent of decolonisation throughout the Cold War, you can see in these two maps the size of European empires at the end of World War II in 1945 compared to the end of the Cold War in 1991. The USA and USSR usually dominated the newly independent countries, both economically and politically, in what became known as neo-colonialism, that is, new colonialism. So now we will move on to the events of the early Cold War. We can visualize these events chronologically in a timeline. The early Cold War revolved around the Grand Alliance's victory in World War II, and the wartime conferences in particular. From November 28th until December 1st, 1943, the Grand Alliance leaders Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill met in Tehran to discuss how to win the war. The UK and USA agreed to help the USSR in Europe, and the USSR agreed to help the USA in Japan. So on June 6, 1944, the USA and UK invaded Normandy, and by the end of 1944, the Grand Alliance was winning the war in Europe. In October 1944, Churchill and Stalin met in Moscow to divide Europe between them into areas of influence. The agreement was called the Naughty Document by Churchill, but it is also referred to as the Percentages Agreement. After success in 1944, the Grand Alliance met again from February 4th until the 11th, 1945. This time, the Big Three met at Yalta, with the intention of deciding what the post-war world would look like. They agreed on many issues such as trials for Nazi war criminals, the division of Berlin and Germany into occupation zones immediately after the war, Soviet reparations, and the establishment of the United Nations. Stalin also agreed to allow free elections in Eastern Europe as soon as possible. After Yalta, the Big Three raced towards Berlin to be the first to capture the city and as much territory as they could. On April 12th, US President Franklin Roosevelt died of a stroke. He was replaced by Harry Truman, a military man who disliked Stalin and communism. At about this time in April, the Red Army reached Berlin, and on May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. By this time, the USSR had captured Berlin as well as 100 miles of territory west of the capital. This meant that Berlin would be 100 miles within the Soviet occupation zone of East Germany, until a solution on German unification could be made. The Second World War in Europe had ended, but it continued in the Pacific against Japan. On June 28, 1945, the USSR showed a half-hearted commitment to democracy in Eastern Europe, allowing for a coalition government to form in Poland, which was heavily in favour of the communists and sympathetic to Moscow. And, on July 16th, the USA's Manhattan Project, which had been researching atomic weapons since the start of the war, detonated its first atomic bomb, but it kept it a secret from the other leaders. On July 17th, just one day after the detonation of the atomic bomb, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill met at Potsdam. From the 17th until August 2nd, they tried to make progress on the agreements made at Yalta that February, but found it difficult to come to any compromises. While the Big Three acknowledged the communist-friendly Polish government and allowed Stalin to keep extracting reparations from East Germany, they could not agree on whether to reunite Germany or not. When Stalin was confronted about not allowing free elections in Eastern Europe, as agreed at Yalta, he believed that the Western powers were trying to interfere with his sphere of influence, which was granted to him by Churchill in the Percentages Agreement. Truman hinted to Stalin that he had a powerful new weapon, which Stalin used to accuse the USA of keeping secrets from its allies. On July 27th, midway through the Potsdam Conference, it was announced that anti-communist leader of the UK, Winston Churchill, had been replaced by a socialist leader, Clement Attlee. But despite these growing tensions, the Grand Alliance was still intact in 1945. Stalin kept his promise to the USA and invaded Japan on August 8, 1945. But this was overshadowed by the USA's use of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima 2 days earlier, shocking Stalin and the world. The USA then dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan surrendered on September 2nd. The USA emerged as the most powerful nation in the world. The USSR and Britain began their race to have their own nuclear weapons. After September 2nd, 1945, the USA and USSR no longer had a common enemy, and their relationship really began to fall apart. US Ambassador to Moscow, George Kennan, sent an 8,000-word telegram to Washington on February 22, 1946, explaining that the USSR was a formidable enemy, and that it should be contained at every possible opportunity. On September 27th that year, the Soviet ambassador to Washington, Nikolai Novikov, sent a similar telegram back to the USSR, explaining that the USA was trying to dominate the world using its military and capitalist economy. So, in 3 years, the USA and USSR moved from allies to suspicious rivals. This rivalry was economic, political, ideological, and military. In the next lesson, we will look at the events and relations between the USA and USSR from 1946 up until 1958. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.